Good day. Today's lesson is the introduction to the quadratic formula. And we just want to remember that most of what we've been doing so far, we've been learning how to solve quadratic equations with factoring. And again, remember, a quadratic equation has the general form of ax squared plus bx plus c. You've seen that a lot of times already, including in the last chapter when we were looking at the graphical features of a quadratic. So let's just review quickly that we know how to solve by factoring. So we got a couple examples just to refresh our memory, and then we'll move into the quadratic formula. So remember, when you're solving by factoring, the first thing you must do is you set the equation equal to 0. And then you factor, and then you solve for each resulting parenthesis. So first thing we need to do is, I'm going to slide it over, make it a little bigger, and we've got to get that equal to 0. So I got to get that minus 6 out of there with a plus 6. When I do that, the next step, of course, this will cancel. I'm going to put like a addition sign there, like we're going to add them up. And when we do that, that cancels. And we get x squared. Now nothing happens with that 6, but we notice we have it in that ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And now we set it equal to 0. Next step, factor it. So it's a trinomial, 3 terms. A is equal to 1, so we don't need to use the ACB or split the middle. And we're going to put the x's in the first slot. And I can see that there's plus signs everywhere, so we know we're going to multiply to be positive 6 and add, multiply to be positive 6 and add to be 5. 3 and 2. And now, we're not done because we need to solve for the x. So in the first parenthesis, we have that x plus 3. We're going to set that equal to 0, and we have x plus 2, and we're going to set that equal to 0. And we should get negative 3, and we should get negative 2. So there's our two answers. Hopefully that wasn't difficult, since we've already had a video on solving quadratics. And let's take example number 2. Oh, this one's already set equal to 0. So our process is still the same. Set it equal to 0. We have to factor it. Now, this is a binomial. This has 2 terms, unlike the previous one that had 3 terms. But still, we notice something special. We have the difference, and 36 is one of those perfect squares. So we're going to give this a try as the difference of 2 perfect squares, where in order to get the x squared, it's x and x. In order to end up with a minus sign, one has to be plus, one has to be minus. And the important thing about 36 is, remember, the perfect square of 6 is 36. And now we look in each side, each parenthesis. I'm going to kind of make a shortcut here. If I have a plus 6 that I have to make go to 0, remember, trying to get it to go to 0, I need a negative 6 in the first parenthesis and a positive 6 in the second parenthesis. Okay, so we did a couple refreshers on how to solve using factoring. But there's some times where an expression does not factor. So today we're going to talk about the approach of solving these quadratic equations using this quadratic formula. And of course, we begin by once again telling you that there's our general standard form, okay, of a quadratic, and you notice it's set equal to 0, just like we had to do when we were factoring. So before we use the quadratic formula, let's make sure we have that ax squared bx plus c, and it's set equal to 0. So when you look at the quadratic formula here, you're going to say, wait a minute, I've seen things like this before. So it looks like those a, b's, and c's are the a, b's, and c's, the coefficients of the quadratic that we used when we were trying to find the vertex in the last chapter, where we had negative b over 2a, and then we had to substitute it in. So we have a couple little things here. Let's look at some of the features. Let's look at the vocabulary. We have this square root symbol, and we're going to use our calculator when we need to simplify that square root. And we see that there's a calculation under that square root. That square root calculation tells us a lot. In fact, we call it a special name. It's called the discriminant, and it's the b squared minus 4ac, which is the calculation under the radical sign. Because if you didn't look at that, if I blotted that out for a second, you would look and say, well, the rest of this is, oh my goodness, wait a minute, that's that negative b over 2a again. So the rest of the formula is not hard to do some calculations with. Let's see. That's still not erasing the way I want it to. I think I'm just going to undo and see what I can get out of there. So, I guess not. So I guess I got to erase that mess after all. Okay. Bear with me for a second while we do that. Okay, so we're looking at this quadratic equation, and the first thing we see is negative b, okay? And we decided to stick that in as one of our definitions, that it's important to realize down here, we'll do that one with a blue, that the negative b term just means the opposite of whatever the b is, right? Negative b over 2a, you've seen that before. But some people get mixed up. Remember that a lot of people plop the b down without changing the sign of it, okay? So here's the process. Here's the steps. You guys like when there's steps. Step 1, arrange it in standard form. In other words, make sure it's an ax plus ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. And like as if we were graphing, or if we were factoring using the ACB method, always distinguish what's the A, list it out, what's the B, what's the C. Then we'll substitute it into the formula, and then we'll simplify it. Okay? And that will give us our solutions. Okay. Many times, the quadratic formula is designed to give you 2 solutions. However, there are times where we can get 1 solution or even no solutions. Now, where would I get 2 solutions? Let's go back up to the top, and let me use a bright green marker. You see up the top in the formula there, I'm marking this weird symbol, and it's a mathematical symbol, and it's a symbol that represents 2 symbols in one. It's a plus sign and it's a minus sign. And mathematicians just kind of push them together, and we call it a plus or minus sign. And so we actually have 2 symbols, and we'll get 2 separate answers from those symbols. We'll use a plus sign to get one answer, and then we'll do the calculation again with a minus sign, and that'll get us a second solution. Okay, let's go to the page after this and see where we are. So, our first example using the quadratic formula. We want to solve for x in x squared minus 3x minus 7. Now, we could tell by looking that that does not factor, because we've got to get numbers that multiply to be 7. Oh, that's easy, 1 times 7. And we got to make them add to be negative 3. Well, that's not happening with 1 and 7. So using factoring won't allow us to solve this equation. So we're going to use our quadratic formula, and you can see that I placed it right underneath here, and when you're doing your work, you should kind of write it out a few times. And we're going to follow those steps, which were 1, arrange it so that it's in standard form. It is, right? It's the squared term first, then the b term, the c term, and it's equal to 0. So let's now label A, B, and C. A is 1, B is -3, and C is -7. Once we have that, all we need to do is substitute. Maybe have our calculator out to do some of these calculations. So let's see what it says. X equals, okay, we're going to go here. -b, negative, and b is -3. Now I'm saving the step. I know some of you guys can combine that right off. Let's just substitute, okay? Plus or minus. Okay, and the key is right in here. We want to know what the b squared is. And you notice when I substitute, I'm using parentheses. In fact, I just replaced all those letters that I have to substitute into with a parenthesis. So I've got to fill that first parenthesis up with b, and b is -3. And I've got to fill after the 4 the a, and after the a I've got to fill in the c, which is -7 over 2 times, on the bottom of the fraction, 2 parentheses a is 1. Okay, so we made the substitutions. Now, let's simplify a couple steps, a little at a time. First of all, that double -3 up here is going to be +3, plus or minus. Now, let's focus on what's going on inside that square root symbol, or under the square root symbol. So b squared, first of all, we've got to take -3 times -3 on the calculator. You must put a parenthesis around the -3 or it'll give you the wrong answer, because we know a -3 times a -3 is a +9, not a -9. And if we leave that parenthesis out when we're calculating on our calculator, it's going to give us -9. Okay. Now, we're going to multiply first of all, we got to take away 4 times 1 times 4 times 1 times -7. So that's going to be, here's the minus sign, and just to change it here, we're going to have a -28. Okay. So this calculation here in yellow, right here, turns out to be this calculation, and we still have that negative sign there, that subtraction sign actually, sorry, the subtraction sign there. And keep in mind, it's all over 2 times 1, which is 2. So we're getting there, and I'm going nice and slow. The next problem will move a little quicker. So I got 9 plus 28 over 2, which is 3, plus or minus the square root of. That turns out to be 37 over 2. So now, that's what x is, right? All this is x equals x equals x equals x equals. So now we go to our calculator. So we're going to get an approximation today. We're going to try and use our calculator to get the square root of 37. Some calculators you have to put the square root in first. Sometimes you have to put the number in first and then hit the square root button. And so let's see what we get here. I've got 3, and I'm going to put that in. You know what I'm going to do first? I'm going to do that separation, and then we'll go to our calculator. I'm going to put the plus sign separate here. And now I'm going to rewrite that down below as 3, and we'll use the green. I'm going to use the minus sign there, time with the square root of 37 over 2. So we're going to have 1 with the plus sign and 1 with the minus sign. And there's where our two answers are going to be. So we're going to work straight across, right up at the top one, and we're going to hit our calculator now. And when we hit the square root of 36, we get 6.08. We're going to divide that by 2. When we do that, use our calculator now, right? So we're going to have 9.08 divided by 2, and our first answer turns out to be 4.54. There's our first answer for x. And now we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to use the minus sign with 6.08 divided by 2. That's going to give us negative 3.08 over 2, which is going to give us a negative answer now, negative 1.54. And there's our second answer. Okay. Well, it's kind of hard to check these answers when they have these crazy decimals in there. So we're just going to stop there, trust ourselves, and trust that I gave you the right answer. So there's the process, right? Once you know what A, B, and C is, right up at the top here, where I'm boxing out in blue, then everything else is pulling out the calculator, changing that, calculating that square root, changing it to a number, and then at the very end, we get our final answers here. Okay, let's try the next problem. For example number 2, solve for x. Here's our formula. Here's our equation that we need to solve for, and there's our quadratic formula. And I already saved us the work. We've got a is equal to 2, b is equal to 3, and c is equal to negative 6. In a second, we're going to substitute it in, see what we get. And then underneath, you notice I have a little bit more on the bottom of the page. I have this question that says, how might this look as one of our test questions in math, in my open math? So we're going to work our problem out and then see what they want us to fill in here. It does look like something like one of our online questions, and I actually took it similar to one of our online questions so that you can be familiar with it and not get hung up with, after we get the answer on the top half of the page, not knowing how to enter the answers in our test format. So we'll do that at the bottom of the page. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to substitute, right? It's already in quad, it's already set equal to 0, it's already in standard form. We're able to get our A, B, and C out. So we're going to have negative b is 3, plus or minus the square root of, now watch how I do that, b squared minus 4ac. You notice I'm making these big gaps that I'm going to fill up with numbers, over 2 times a. So those parentheses are my a's, b's, and c's. So first one is b squared. So that turns out to be 3 squared minus 4 times a. A is a 2, we'll put them right in there, and c is a negative 6, and 2a is 2. So now we're going to calculate that, and we're going to make it a little smaller so we can get it in there, negative 3 plus or minus the square root of, that's a 9, and the double negative multiplication is plus 48 over 2 times 2 is 4 on the bottom. Okay. So let's see what we get here. We get negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 57 over 4. Okay. Now we're going to hold off for a second before we go to our calculator and get those square roots. And the reason I want you to hold off is now I want you to look at how the test would want your answer so far. Notice they're saying write your answer x equals where the n is the number right in front of the plus or minus sign. So for us, that's the negative 3. I'm going to take that and put it in here where they want us to input our answer in the blank space. Then it's saying I want you to take the d, well that's the number that's under the radical, that's 57, and the m is the bottom of the fraction, the number on the bottom of the fraction. I'll save the arrow, but for us that's a 4. So once you solve the quadratic formula, before you get the decimal answers, it asks you for whole number answers first. So it asks you for those values. Okay. Now, at the end, it's saying, use your calculator, approximate the square root, and give me an answer with a comma in between the first and the second answer. So let's see what we got here. We'll go to green. So we're going to work this problem now and get those two decimals. So we're going to have -3 plus or minus, and we're going to get the square root of 57, right? That turns out to be 7.55 over 4. So we're going to have two answers now. I'm going to split that plus and minus sign out into two separate answers, and I'll use the black marker. So we're going to have, our first one's going to be -3 plus 7.55 over 4. The whole thing over 4. And the second answer, I'm going to use the minus sign. The second answer is going to be -3 minus 7.55 over 4. So let's see what those numbers turn out to be. This turns out to be 4.55 over 4, and that turns out to be about, approximately, these are all approximations when we pull our calculator out, 1.14. And here we're going to subtract, and we get -10.55 over 4. And that answer turns out to be -2.64. So there are our two answers in decimal form. And guess where they go? They go down here at the bottom. So what they'd be looking for in your answer is 1.14 separated by a comma, -2.64. So once you solve the quadratic formula, you can see that our format for my open math provides us, one, a place to put the nice round numbers before you hit the calculator, and then on the bottom, the answers, the actual approximate answers using the calculator. Okay, that should be enough for you to master the material in that section on the quadratic formula. See you next time.